The beam from Detective Grady's flashlight sliced through the November rain like a blade, finding Ivy huddled beneath the condemned 4th Street Bridge, her ribs pressed against her soaked shirt like a cage with nothing left to protect. 27 years old, but looking 40, barely 100 plumes if you counted the rainwater weighing her down. Her pale green eyes had long lost their fire, and a faded scar ran down her left forearm, a reminder of the night she almost gave up entirely. "I told you yesterday, you filthy rat!" Grady's voice dripped with contempt as he kicked her cardboard shelter apart, scattering her few possessions into the mud. "You're still here. That's loitering. That's vagrancy. That's my problem." Ivy struggled to her feet, coughing violently, her diseased lungs burning with every breath. "I'm leaving. I'm just your garbage," Grady interrupted, crushing the bag of aluminum cans she had spent a week collecting under his boot heel. "You know what people do with garbage? They throw it away." What Grady didn't know, what he couldn't see through the sheets of rain hammering the bridge above, was that in exactly 47 seconds, an armored black Maybach worth $500,000 would hydroplane on the highway overhead. The driver, a mountain of a man named Vincent Castellano, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, known as the Devil of Manhattan, would lose control at 70 miles an hour. And the broken homeless woman Grady was currently degrading would make a choice that would shake the entire criminal underworld of New York. Because physics says a 100-pound woman cannot pull 200 kilograms of unconscious muscle out of a submerged sinking vehicle in freezing water. But Ivy Sullivan had stopped believing in rules a long time ago. If this story satisfies your soul, hit the like button to tell me. Share it to those who need to be reminded that even the most broken people can become someone's miracle. And subscribe to follow this journey because Ivy's story is just beginning. She saved a devil from drowning, never knowing that devil would burn the whole world down to save her in return. Grady spat into the mud beside Ivy's foot and turned away. The beam of his flashlight cut once more through the rain like a blade slashing the dark before vanishing. The patrol engine roared, red taillights smeared into the downpour. Then everything fell silent. Ivy stood there shaking. Rain ran down the cracks in her face as if the sky itself were crying for her. She knelt into the mud. Numb fingers searched blindly for whatever was left. The second jacket had been stomped into a puddle by Grady. The water bottle was shattered. The aluminum cans she'd spent an entire week collecting were now crushed under his boots and not worth a single cent. But she picked them up anyway, one by one, because they were all she had. Her hand found the cheap necklace on her chest where her mother's silver ring still hung. Cold, but still there. Still there. She closed her eyes for a second and tried to remember her mother's voice, but the memory had faded like a photograph blurred by rain. Her mother had told her she had to live, but living like this was no different from dying. Ivy was just about to stand when the sound tore through the night. Not thunder, not rain, but the scream of tires skidding on the highway above, sharp and desperate, rubber clawing at wet asphalt in the hopeless struggle of someone trying to wrestle life back from death. Then metal slammed into metal. The guardrails shattered. Ivy looked up just as the black Maybach ripped through the barrier as if it were paper. The massive car hung suspended in the air for a moment that felt like forever. She saw it clearly. Every detail burned into her eyes. The armored luxury vehicle slowly turned in midair. Rain exploded around it like shattered crystals. Then gravity remembered its duty. The Maybach plunged nose first and struck the river with a sound like a bomb. Water shot 15 meters into the air. Waves crashed toward the bank where Ivy stood. She watched the car sink. The front was already swallowed by black water. Only the rear was still visible, like the hand of a drowning man reaching up in a final plea. Through the window glass, she saw a figure, large, motionless head, slumped over the steering wheel. On the highway above, there were horns, screams, someone calling 911. But down here by the river, there was only Ivy in the sinking car. 60 seconds, maybe less. That was all the time the man inside had before the river claimed him forever. Her mind screamed at her to run. Who was she to save anyone? She couldn't even save herself. She was nothing but trash. Grady was right. She was nothing at all. But her legs didn't listen. They carried her toward the river one step at a time as if something else were moving her. Ivy pulled off her outer jacket and threw it into the mud. Then the second one, then her torn shoes. She stood there in only a thin layer of clothing, shivering in the cold rain, staring at the black ink of the water waiting for her. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know if he was good or bad. She didn't know if he deserved to be saved. She only knew that someone was dying and she was the only one who could do anything. When was the last time she'd felt she mattered? She couldn't remember. Maybe tonight she would. Or maybe tonight she would die with a stranger beneath the freezing river. Either way, at least she wouldn't die as someone useless. Ivy drew a deep breath. Her lungs burned and whistled in pain. Then she threw herself into the water. The water hit her like the fist of death, 4 degrees. That was the temperature of the river in November. Cold enough to freeze blood in the veins. Cold enough to stop the heart if she stayed in it too long. The thermal shock blasted every thought out of Ivy's mind. Her lungs spasmed, her body locked, and for 3 horrifying seconds she forgot how to swim. She sank. Darkness swallowed her. Water flooded her nose and mouth, and she thought this was it. This was how she died. Not from hunger, not from illness, but because she was foolish enough to jump into a river to save a stranger. Then survival instinct struck. The instinct she had thought and dead for a long time suddenly flared like fire in a storm. Her arms began to fan the water. Her legs began to kick, and she remembered distant summers when her mother was still alive, when they went to the public pool, and her mother taught her how to float. "My daughter is strong," her mother said. "You can do anything you want." Ivy kicked hard, her body cutting through ink-black water toward the sinking car. Every stroke was a battle. The current pulled her downstream, trying to carry her away like it carried so many other scraps of debris. But she was not debris. At least not tonight. She kicked wildly, swimming against the flow, her lungs beginning to burn from lack of oxygen and from the chronic illness that gnawed at her day by day. 10 miles, 5 miles. The Maybach loomed before her like a black monster being swallowed by the ocean. The front of the car was already completely submerged, water pouring in through every crack, dragging it deeper with each second. Ivy dove down, her hands groping along the body of the car until they found the driver's side window. Through the glass, she saw him, the largest man she had ever seen in her life, shoulders as wide as a doorway, chest like a barrel, head slumped against the deployed airbag. Blood flowing from a wound on his forehead and staining the water around him red. He was motionless, maybe dead, maybe not. Ivy had no time to check. She pulled the door handle. Locked? Of course it was locked. The impact had triggered the automatic system and turned the luxury car into a moving coffin. Ivy's lungs began screaming for air. She had 30 seconds, maybe less, before she would have to surface or drown with this man. She looked around in desperation, her eyes stinging from the filthy river water, and she saw it, a broken chunk of concrete from the bridge pillar, half submerged on the riverbed. Ivy grabbed it, her fingers clawing into stone and mud, nails breaking, skin tearing, but she didn't care. She lifted the block, heavy as if the whole world were pressing down on her shoulders, and struck the window. The first blow did nothing. The second made spiderweb cracks. The third, with every shred of strength left in her exhausted body, shattered the glass. Water rushed into the car like a waterfall, equalizing the pressure in an instant. Ivy dropped the concrete, slipped through the broken frame, shards cutting into her arms and shoulders, but she felt no pain. She felt only one thing. This man had to live. She didn't know why it mattered. She only knew it did. Ivy grabbed his collar, an expensive leather vest, and pulled. He was twice her weight. His body was like stone, but Ivy had dragged heavier trash bags through crowded streets for a few coins. She had survived things worse than death. She would not be defeated by a river. She kicked, hauled him out of the car, out of death's grip, and began to swim upward. Every meter was a lifetime. Every kick was a prayer. Her lungs were about to burst. Her vision began to blur. Sparks of light danced before her eyes like fireflies in a graveyard. Then she broke the surface. Air flooded her lungs like life flooding the dead. She choked and vomited river water, but her hand never released the man's collar. She swam toward the bank, stroke by weak stroke, exhausted. And when her knees touched mud, She dragged him up, laid him on his back, then collapsed beside him. The night sky spun above her. Rain kept falling, cold and relentless. Ivy lay there gasping, her body shaking uncontrollably, and she thought maybe tonight she would die from cold instead of drowning. But at least she would not die alone, and at least the man beside her was still breathing. She heard rescue sirens in the distance, saw flashlight beams sweeping the riverbank. They were coming. Someone was coming. Ivy closed her eyes and darkness held her like a mother holding a lost child who had finally found her way home. The beam of a flashlight swept across the riverbank and pulled Ivy back from the edge of unconsciousness. She didn't know how long she had been lying there. Maybe a few seconds, maybe a few minutes. But the shouting and the sound of running feet coming closer woke the survival instinct inside her. Not the instinct of a hero who had just saved a life, but the instinct of a homeless girl who had learned that other people's attention never brought anything good. The police would ask for papers. She didn't have any. They would ask for an address. She didn't have one. They would see her as a filthy drifter, and they would call Grady, and Grady would have an excuse to lock her somewhere she would never escape from. Ivy clenched her teeth and forced her exhausted body upright. Her head spun, her stomach lurched, but she crawled toward the darkness beneath the bridge anyway. Inch by inch, fingernails scraping through mud, knees raw against gravel, she dragged herself into the place where the light couldn't reach. She looked back one last time. The rescue team had reached the man. They were pressing on his chest, giving him artificial breaths, doing everything Ivy didn't know how to do. She saw his chest rise. She saw him cough. He was alive. Something inside her loosened. A knot she hadn't known she was carrying. She had done it. She, a homeless nobody, Grady called trash, had saved a life. Maybe it was the only meaningful thing she had done in all of her 27 years of existence. Ivy turned away and vanished into the darkness like a ghost, as if she had never been there. She didn't know that above her, on the corner of 4th Street Bridge, a traffic camera was recording. Its lens captured everything. The Maybach losing control, the plunge into the river, and a small, thin figure throwing herself into the water in the rain like a mad angel. The camera recorded the moment she broke the surface the second time, dragging a body twice her size behind her. It recorded her lying exhausted on the riverbank, shaking like a leaf in a storm. And it recorded her crawling into the darkness, disappearing from the scene before anyone could see her face. The image was blurred and smeared by rain, but still clear enough to show that something impossible had happened. A tiny woman had done what physics said could not be done. And then she vanished as if she had never existed. The ambulance roared, bloom, and red lights tearing through the night. Vincent Castellano was placed on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face, blood still seeping from the wound on his head. No one knew the man they were saving was the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. No one knew the car that had sunk into the river was worth $500,000 and armored against bullets. And no one, not even Vincent himself, knew that the person who had pulled him from death's jaws was only a homeless girl, weighing 45 kilos, shivering in the darkness not far away, coughing up blood and praying she would survive the night. But in the days to come, when the devil of Manhattan woke up and learned that he was still alive, he would find that video. And he would turn the entire city upside down to find the ghost who had saved his life. Vincent Castellano opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was the stark white ceiling of a room he knew better than any hospital in the world. This was the Castellano family's secret medical facility, buried deep inside an ordinary office building in Manhattan, where Dr. Nathan Reed had stitched him and his men back together through countless bullet wounds, knife cuts, and injuries no public hospital was ever allowed to know about. His head throbbed as if someone were hammering at it from the inside. He tried to sit up, but his body refused, and a hand pressed down on his shoulder, forcing him flat again. "Stay still, boss," Marco's voice said beside him, familiar and tight with strain. "You almost died." Vincent turned his head and looked at the man who had followed him for 15 years. The man he trusted more than blood, because blood could betray you, and Marco could not. Marco's face was paler than usual, his beard patchy as if he hadn't slept for days, and his eyes held something Vincent rarely saw in anyone. "Real fear. What happened?" Vincent asked, his voice rough as if he had swallowed the entire river. And then he remembered. Rain, the highway, brakes failing, the guardrail breaking, black water. The car was sabotaged, Marco said bluntly. No detours, the brake line was cut. Professional, clean, almost no trace, but Leo checked the wreck under the river and found evidence. Vincent closed his eyes for a second. The brakes were cut. Someone had tried to kill him. Someone reckless enough, stupid enough, or desperate enough to go after the devil of Manhattan. Moretti? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. 99%? Marco nodded. That bastard has wanted to topple you for a long time. Maybe he thought this was the right moment. Vincent would deal with Moretti later. He would tear him apart piece by piece and send him back to his family in separate boxes. But right now, something else gnawed at his mind. A faint memory, a vague sense of small hands gripping his collar, of his body being dragged through freezing water. Who pulled me out of the car? He asked. Marco was silent for a moment, and that silence said more than any answer. That's the strangest part, Marco said as he took out a tablet, swiped the screen a few times and handed it to Vincent. We got the traffic camera footage. You need to see this. Vincent took the tablet, pressed play, and watched. The video quality was poor, blurred by rain and darkness, but still clear enough to show what happened. The Maybach tearing through the guardrail, the plunge into the river, and then a figure, small, thin, throwing herself into the water like a mad woman. Vincent watched the figure vanish beneath the surface, and he counted 10 seconds. 10 seconds, 20, 30, long enough that he thought she had drowned. Then she surfaced, and she was dragging him with her. A woman who couldn't have weighed more than half of him, pulling him through the current, swimming upstream with his body like an anchor tied to her throat. She hauled him onto the bank. She lay there shaking, exhausted. And when the rescue team came close, she crawled into the darkness and disappeared like a ghost. Who is she? Vincent asked, his eyes still fixed on the screen, on the fading shape dissolving into night. We don't know yet. No face, no identity, only that she was under the 4th Street Bridge that night, probably homeless. Vincent touched the screen and froze the frame at the last moment before the ghost vanished. He stared at the small silhouette that had risked her life in freezing water to save a man she didn't know. A man she might have let drown if she'd known who he was. Find her, Vincent said, his voice no longer weak, but cold again with the familiar steel of the devil of Manhattan. Turn this whole city upside down if you have to. Find her and bring her here. 3 days, 72 hours. That was how long Vincent Castellano's people tore apart the area around 4th Street Bridge looking for a ghost. They questioned other homeless people, small-time drug dealers on street corners, the girls who worked the night streets looking for clients, anyone who might have seen a thin woman with tangled brown hair. Most shook their heads. Some spoke of a girl they sometimes saw under the bridge, silent as a shadow, never bothering anyone, never asking for anything. They called her the ghost. The irony was sharp. Leo was the one who found her. The quiet 28-year-old driver and bodyguard followed faint traces from under the bridge to the eastern junkyard, from the junkyard to an abandoned church, and finally to a dark alley 2 blocks from 4th Street Bridge. She was there, curled up behind a large dumpster, her body shaking uncontrollably, even though her lips were blue with cold. Leo almost walked past her without noticing. Because she was so small, she nearly dissolved into the dark. Just a pile of rags among garbage. Then she coughed, a wet, bloody cough that tore from her lungs. And Leo stopped. He knelt beside her, and what he saw made even a man used to death shudder. She was burning, not burning in flame, but burning with fever so high her skin radiated heat, even while her body shook with cold. Her breathing was ragged and wet. Every breath a battle she was slowly losing. Her eyes were half open but saw nothing. Only 2 pale green discs sinking into unconsciousness. Pneumonia, Leo realized at once. She had been in the cold water too long that night, and her exhausted body had no strength to fight anything. She was dying right here in this filthy alley between dumpsters and stench. The ghost who had saved the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast was dying, and no one in the world cared. Leo pulled out his phone and dialed Vincent. One ring and Vincent's voice came on, cold and impatient. Have you found her? I have. Leo looked down at the small, shivering body at his feet, listened to her weak, wheezing breath, like water seeping through a crack. But there's a problem, boss. She's dying. Silence on the other end, long and heavy. Then Vincent's voice came again, and for the first time, Leo heard something in it besides coldness. Bring her here immediately. Call Dr. Reed and have everything ready. She mustn't die. Do you hear me? She mustn't die. Leo ended the call, took off his jacket and wrapped it around Ivy's thin body. She was light as a child when he lifted her. So light he wondered how this body could have dragged a man weighing 90 kgs from a sinking car. She mustn't die, he whispered Vincent's order again like a prayer. Hold on, Ghost. My boss owes you his life. Ivy woke up and didn't know where she was. And that was the first thing that frightened her, because for the past 2 years, she had always known exactly where she was, under 4th Street Bridge, among concrete and rust and the roar of traffic above. But this would end under the bridge. This place was soft, warm, and smelled clean. A smell she had forgotten a long time ago. She lay on a bed larger than any she had ever seen in her life, with white satin sheets smooth as water, and a comforter so thick she felt as if she were sinking into a cloud. The room around her was as big as the apartment she and her mother once lived in, with red velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and paintings on the wall she didn't understand, but knew were worth more than her life. Ivy tried to sit up, but her body refused. An intravenous line was in her hand, and she realized there was a heart monitor beeping steadily beside the bed. Where was she? Who had brought her here? And why? The door opened, and Ivy had the answer to at least one of those questions. The man who entered was so tall he had to dip his head slightly to pass through the doorway, shoulders as wide as a window frame, muscles shifting under an expensive black shirt, and a face carved from marble with a square jaw, a straight nose and steel gray eyes. A faint scar ran from the corner of his left eye down his cheekbone, not making him uglier, but more dangerous. This was the man she had pulled from the sinking car. She knew it instantly, even though that night she had only seen him through darkness and muddy water. That massive build, that heavy weight as she dragged him through the current. It couldn't be anyone else. He was alive, and he was standing here looking at her with eyes she couldn't read. Vincent said nothing for a longer moment. He only stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Then he stepped forward, drew a luxurious armchair to the bedside, and sat down, still keeping distance, but close enough that she could see every line of his face. "You're the one who saved me," he said, his voice low and rough. A statement, not a question. Ivy didn't answer. She had no strength to, and she didn't know what to say. "Why?" Vincent asked, leaning forward, his gray eyes drilling into hers as if he wanted to dig the answer out of her soul. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I did. You jumped into freezing water to save a stranger. Why?" Ivy looked straight into his eyes and saw no reason to lie. "Because you were dying, and I was the only one who could do anything." Vincent blinked as if that answer wasn't in any of the scripts he'd prepared. "You didn't know who I was?" he asked again with a trace of doubt. "Should I have known who you were?" Ivy asked back, and for the first time she saw something on his face other than coldness. "Surprise, real surprise. I'm Vincent Castellano." He said the name as if it explained everything. Ivy waited for the familiar feeling, for fear or recognition to strike, but nothing came. The name meant nothing to her. She had lived under a bridge for 2 years, hadn't read newspapers, hadn't watched the news, hadn't cared about anything except surviving each day. "I don't know who you are," she repeated, her voice from a dry throat. "And does that matter?" Vincent leaned back, and Ivy realized he was looking at her differently now. Not looking down at her the way Grady had, not looking through her the way the rest of the world did, but looking directly at her as if she were a real person worth seeing. "You're not afraid of me," he said, not a question, but an astonished observation. "I stopped being afraid a long time ago," Ivy answered, and she wasn't lying. She had lived through things worse than anything a mafia boss could do to her. She had been to the bottom and learned that when you have nothing left to lose, you have nothing left to fear. Vincent looked at her for a long time, his gray eyes deep and unreadable. Then he did something Ivy didn't expect. He smiled, not wide or warm, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, but it changed his whole face. For the first time, he said softly, as if to himself more than to her, "For the first time, someone has looked me in the eye without trembling." Ivy didn't know what that meant. She only knew she was trapped in this room, in this man's world, and had no way out. But strangely, she didn't feel the need to escape. For the first time in a long while, she felt that someone truly saw her. Vincent stood up, walked to the window, and looked out with his back to Ivy, as if he were weighing something important. "In my world," he began, his voice low and unhurried, "there are rules no one is allowed to break. And one of those rules is about debt." He turned back to her, gray eyes sharp but no longer threatening. "You saved my life. That's the greatest debt a person can owe. And I, Vincent Castellano, don't leave debts unpaid." Ivy wanted to say she didn't need him to repay anything, that she only wanted to leave and go back to her life under the bridge, no matter how miserable that life was. But before she could speak, the door opened again, and an older man entered, around 50, salt and pepper hair, gold-rimmed glasses, carrying a black leather briefcase that made him look very professional. "This is Dr. Nathan Reed," Vincent said briefly. "He'll check your condition." Reed nodded to Ivy with a warm smile and began his examination, checking her pulse, her blood pressure, listening to her lungs, his frown deepening with each step. When he asked Ivy to remove her shirt, she hesitated, but then complied because she had no strength left to resist. The room fell into silence as Dr. Reed saw what was on her body. Old scars crossing her back, traces of beatings from a stepfather years ago, cigarette burns on her shoulder, gifts from the traffickers who once held her, and the long scar on her left arm that she had made herself on the darkest night of her life when she no longer wanted to exist. Derived didn't ask. He only wrote, his face neutral, but his eyes full of compassion. Vincent stood there, and Ivy felt his gaze on her scars. She waited for disgust, for pity, for contempt. But when she glanced at him, she only saw his jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists as if he were holding back rage. "Severe malnutrition," Dr. Reed reported after Ivy dressed again. "Anemia, a lung infection in a dangerous stage. She needs medical care for at least several weeks and a special diet. Otherwise," he shook his head, "she won't survive this winter." Vincent nodded as if he'd known this already. "You'll stay here," he told Ivy, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You'll get medical care, a place to stay, food. In return, you won't leave until I allow it." "I don't need charity," Ivy said, her voice, but still carrying the last of her pride. "This isn't charity." Vincent stepped closer and looked directly into her eyes. "This is me paying a debt. You saved my life. Now I'm saving yours. That's the rule." Ivy wanted to refuse. She didn't trust anyone, especially powerful men. Experience had taught her they always wanted something, and what they wanted usually hurt her. But her body was dying, and she knew it. Every breath was a battle, and she was losing. Her hand drifted to her chest, where her mother's silver ring still rested on the cheap chain. "You have to live," her mother had said in her final days, when cancer had already taken almost all her strength. "No matter what, you have to live." Ivy closed her eyes for a moment and saw her mother's face. A face faded by time, but never gone. Her mother wanted her to live, and maybe, just maybe, this was her only chance. "All right," she opened her eyes and looked at Vincent. "I'll stay." Vincent nodded, and Ivy thought she saw a flicker of relief in his cold gray eyes. But maybe she imagined it. "Good, ma'am," he said, and left the room, leaving Ivy alone with Dr. Reed and the unanswered questions about her future in the world of the Devil of Manhattan. During the first days in the Castellano mansion, Ivy felt like a fish thrown onto dry land. Everything around her was wrong in a way that hurt. The bed was too soft, too wide, too gentle for her to sleep in. She was used to cold concrete, to the roar of traffic, to the need to stay alert, even in her dreams. So on the first night, she pulled the blanket down onto the floor and lay in the corner of the room with her back against the wall and her knees drawn to her chest. Only like that could she close her eyes. Food was another problem. They brought her meals she had never seen in her life. Fine beef, fresh green vegetables, warm bread, and every kind of sweet dessert. But Ivy couldn't finish them. She ate half and hid the rest under her pillow, a habit from the years when she never knew where the next meal would come from. The maid found the leftover food and reported it, but no one said anything to her. They only looked at her with strange eyes as if she were a creature from another planet. She asked for nothing, didn't request new clothes, even though what she wore had been washed, but was still old and torn, didn't ask about Wi-Fi or television or any other luxury in the room. She only sat by the window for hours looking down at the garden, silent as a ghost. On the third day, her door opened and a woman walked in. About 33, long, glossy black hair, gray eyes like Vincent's, but sharper and colder, wearing an elegant gray suit, glittering diamond jewelry, and looking at Ivy as if she were an insect that had crawled into the house, Sofia Castellano. She introduced herself without warmth, Vincent's sister. Ivy stood up, her instinct telling her not to sit when someone stood over her. She said nothing and waited. Sophia walked around the room, her fingers gliding over the table surface as if she feared Ivy had stolen something. "What do you want from my brother?" Sophia asked bluntly. "Money, status, or do you think you can climb into his bed and become the mistress of this place?" Ivy blinked confused. "I don't want anything," she said, her voice rough from days of little speech. "I only want to leave," Sophia snorted, clearly not believing her. "Everyone wants something, especially those who pretend they don't. I'll be watching you, and if you do anything to harm my brother, I'll personally carry you where no one will ever find you." Sophia turned on her heel and left, her heels striking the marble floor like the countdown of a bomb. Ivy watched her go without fear or anger. She had met many people like Sophia, people with power who used it to threaten others. She only felt tired, tired to the bone. In another room of the mansion, Vincent sat before the security camera monitors, watching everything unfold. He saw Ivy remain motionless after Sophia left, saw her return to the corner and look out the window, saw her touch her chest where the silver ring lay beneath her clothes, as if it were the only thing keeping her from fading away. Marco stood beside him watching too. "She's strange," Marco said. "She doesn't demand anything, doesn't complain, doesn't try to seduce anyone or build connections. She just sits there like she's waiting for something." "What is she waiting for?" Vincent asked. Not Marco, but himself. He had met every kind of person in his life. The greedy, the flattering, those willing to do anything to get what they wanted. But he had never met anyone like Ivy. Someone who truly wanted nothing. And that was what he couldn't stop thinking about. That night, a scream tore through the stillness of the Castellano mansion. The guard in the hallway jolted and reached for his weapon. But before he could act, Vincent was already moving. He didn't know why he was there, why he was awake and walking the corridor near her room. But when he heard that scream, his feet carried him without thought. He shoved Ivy's door open and saw a sight that made his frozen heart ache. She wasn't in the bed. She was curled in the corner like a wounded animal, back pressed to the wall, arms wrapped over her head, and she was screaming. Not in anger, not calling for help, but the scream of a soul being torn apart from the inside. The scream of someone reliving the most horrific memories the mind tries to bury. "Please don't," she cried, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I'm sorry. I'll be good. Please don't hit me anymore." Vincent stood there frozen, a man who'd killed without blinking, who'd tortured enemies without hesitation, didn't know what to do with a woman having a nightmare. He'd never comforted anyone and had never needed to. In his world, emotion was weakness, and weakness meant death. But seeing Ivy folded in on herself, he couldn't turn away. He stepped closer slowly like approaching a frightened deer. Knelt a few steps from her, keeping distance, not touching her because he knew sometimes touch made things worse. He knew because he'd once been like her years ago, when his father was still alive and the man's leather belt lived in every one of his nightmares. "Ivy," he said her name, low and steady, trying to reach her through the fog of memory, trapping her. "Ivy, you're here. You're safe." She didn't answer. Her eyes were open but saw nothing. Pale green discs staring into some distant place he couldn't reach. She kept trembling, kept whispering, "Please," he didn't want to hear. "I don't want this." She moaned, tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't even feel. "Please let me go. Please stop." Something flared in Vincent's chest. Rage, medo, and violent. Someone had done this to her. Someone had made her beg in her sleep. Someone had left scars deeper than the ones on her skin, and he wanted to find that person and tear them apart. "You're safe," he repeated, his voice softer, a voice he didn't know he had. "No one can touch you here. I won't let anyone hurt you." A minute passed, then another. Slowly, Ivy's breathing eased. Her shoulders stopped shaking. Her eyes blinked and focused. She looked at Vincent, and in that moment, he saw it. Not weakness, not self-pity, but true brokenness. The kind that comes from a soul crushed too many times and somehow still trying to fit itself back together. He recognized it because he saw it every day in the mirror, in his own eyes. "I'm sorry," Ivy whispered. "You don't need to be," Vincent said, and surprised himself by meaning it. "We all have ghosts." Ivy looked at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes beyond emptiness. Understanding. She understood him without words. Understood he carried unseen scars too. That behind the devil of Manhattan, there was once a frightened child like her. "Do you have nightmares too?" she asked softly. Vincent didn't answer because he didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. He stood, but didn't leave. He pulled a chair close to her corner and sat. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice no longer cold, just tired in the way of someone who'd fought too long. "I'll be here." Ivy watched him for a long moment, as if testing whether he meant it. Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time since arriving, she truly slept. Not the shallow sleep of someone always on guard, but the deep sleep of someone who knew another was keeping watch. Vincent stayed there all night watching her murmur, and wondering why a stranger made him feel less alone than anyone he'd ever known. A few miles away in a shabby bar on the Lower East Side, Detective Richard Grady was on his third glass of whiskey, brooding over the strange disappearance of his favorite prey. The homeless girl under 4th Street Bridge was gone. Grady had gone back there twice since that rainy night, wanting to continue his little game, wanting to see if the girl was stupid enough to stay after his threat. But she wasn't there anymore. The cardboard shelter still lay collapsed in the mud, her few belongings still scattered around, but the girl was nowhere to be found. Grady wasn't the kind of man who let things go. He questioned the other homeless people, threatened a few drug dealers, and finally a starving addict sold him information for cash. The girl had been taken by Castellano's people a few days ago. Grady nearly spat out his whiskey when he heard that name. Vincent Castellano, the devil of Manhattan, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. A man even the police didn't dare touch. Why would someone like that care about a filthy homeless girl? Grady dug deeper using his corrupt connections in the police force and eventually put the pieces together. The accident on 4th Street Bridge that night, the Maybach falling into the river, and a figure jumping in to save the driver. The homeless girl had saved Vincent Castellano's life. Grady laughed, a bitter, greedy laugh. The world was truly ironic. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized long ago. Antonio Moretti. The sworn enemy of the Castellano family and the man who paid Grady for information about police activity. Moretti answered after 2 rings, his voice cold and cautious. "What is it, Grady? I have good news for you." Grady lowered his voice, licking his lips like a snake smelling prey. "Vincent Castellano has a weakness now, a woman." There was a moment of silence. Then Moretti laughed, a low, dangerous laugh, the laugh of a man who'd waited years for this chance. "The devil has a weakness now, interesting. Tell me everything." Grady told him about the homeless girl, about the rescue, about her being in the Castellano mansion protected like something precious. Moretti listened, and when Grady finished, he already had a plan. "If the girl is that important to Vincent," Moretti said slowly, "then she's how we destroy him. Find a way to get close to her, learn her routine, and when the time comes, we'll use her to strike where it hurts Vincent the most." Grady laughed in agreement, not knowing he'd just signed his own death warrant. 2 weeks passed like a dream Ivy didn't dare believe was real. Under Dr. Reed's care and a special diet, her body began to heal in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her pale skin slowly warmed to a soft pink. The bloody coughs thinned and then disappeared. She gained 3 kilos, and though she was still far thinner than normal, she no longer looked like a walking skeleton. But the greatest change wasn't in her body, it was in her soul. Ivy began to read. The Castellano mansion's library was vast and full of books she'd never dared dream of touching. She started with simple novels, then moved to poetry, then to philosophy. She read as if making up for the years she'd been denied learning, as if every page were a door into a world she'd been refused. She also began to talk to the staff, brief and shy at first, then longer and easier. Rosa, the elderly cook with calloused hands and a gentle smile, was the first to break through Ivy's shell. She brought her special meals and told her stories about her home in Mexico. She asked nothing in return. She simply let Ivy know someone cared. She's genuinely good. Marco told Vincent during one of the daily briefings, I've watched her for 2 weeks now. There's nothing suspicious, no contact with anyone outside, no attempt to gather information about the family. She just reads, eats, and sometimes talks with Rosa. If this is an act, she's the best performer I've ever seen. Vincent didn't reply, but he knew Marco was right. Ivy had no schemes. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever known in this world of deception and betrayal. And maybe that was why he couldn't stop thinking about her. He began to appear in the places she frequented, the library in the afternoon, the garden in the morning, the corridor outside her room at night. He told himself it was about security, about protecting his investment. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. He wanted to be near her. That was all. One December night when snow began to fall softly outside the windows, Vincent found Ivy standing alone on the great living room balcony. She was wearing a coat Rosa had found for her. Her arms were wrapped around herself. She was watching the snowflakes as if they were something miraculous. He stepped beside her without speaking. They stood in silence, shoulders nearly touching, breath blooming white in the cold air. Ivy didn't turn to look at him, but she didn't move away either. Thank you, she said after a long while, her voice light as wind. Vincent didn't ask what she was thanking him for. There was too much and too little at once. He only nodded, though she couldn't see it. Then she added even more softly, thank you for not asking. Vincent understood. She meant thank you for not questioning her past, for not digging into the scars she tried to hide, for not forcing her to explain how she became this way. He simply let her be herself. And sometimes that was the greatest gift one person could give another. They stood there until snow dusted their shoulders white. Two figures in a winter night, silent together and not alone. That morning, snow covered the garden of the Castellano mansion like a pure white blanket, hiding all the stains of the world beneath it. Ivy stood by the window, looking out at the picture-perfect scene, and felt a strange longing rise in her chest. She wanted to go outside. She wanted to touch the snow, feel the cold on her skin, remember what the world beyond these four walls felt like. Dr. Reed had allowed her gentle movement, and when she asked Leo, the quiet bodyguard nodded in agreement. They would only walk around the garden. What danger could there be? That was the first mistake. The garden was wide and silent, bare rose bushes, heavy with snow, marble paths glittering under the weak winter sun. Ivy walked slowly, breathing in the biting cold, and for the first time in a long while, she felt almost peaceful. Leo followed a few steps behind, his eyes constantly sweeping the area like a hound, sensing danger. But even the best hounds can miss the enemy. The first gunshot ripped through the stillness without warning. Leo collapsed before Ivy could even turn, his blood blooming red across the white snow like a deadly flower. Four men appeared from behind the bushes, dressed in black, faces covered, guns aimed straight at her. They said nothing, demanded nothing, only advanced with the steps of men used to kidnapping and killing. Ivy stood there, her heart racing, and she knew she had two choices: surrender or fight. Surrender meant being taken, tortured, used like a pawn in a power game she didn't understand. Fighting meant possibly dying right here on the snow, only a few miles from the bridge she had once lived under. She chose to fight, not because she was brave, but because she had endured too much to surrender. Now, when the lead man moved toward her, Ivy lunged for Leo, not to flee, but because she knew he had a gun. The gunman didn't expect that reaction. He thought his prey would freeze or beg like the others. He was wrong. Ivy dropped beside Leo, slid her hand under his jacket, and pulled the pistol he always carried. She didn't know how to shoot. She'd never held a gun before, but she knew how to survive. And sometimes survival meant doing things she didn't think she could do. The lead attacker lunged to grab the gun. Ivy twisted and smashed the butt of the pistol into his temple with all her strength. He fell into the snow unconscious. She didn't stop. She stood and aimed at the remaining three, her hands shaking but her eyes steady. "Back away," she said, her voice so cold she barely recognized it herself. "Back away or I'll shoot." The three men hesitated. They hadn't expected their weak prey to fight back. And in that moment of hesitation, gunfire erupted from the mansion. Vincent and Marco appeared with the guards, weapons roaring, and in less than a minute, the remaining three lay on the snow, either dead or too badly wounded to move. Then everything fell silent. Vincent stepped over bodies, over blood soaking into white snow, and stopped in front of Ivy. She still stood there, the gun in her hand. The blood of the man she struck splashed across her face, dark red against pale skin, but her eyes were calm, frighteningly calm. Not the calm of someone who didn't know fear, but the calm of someone who had faced death too many times to tremble before it anymore. "Leo is hurt," she said evenly. "Call a doctor." Vincent looked at her and saw something new in those extinguished green eyes. Strength, a capacity to fight he hadn't expected from a body so small and broken. She wasn't only fragile, she was a warrior beaten down by life, but never truly surrendered. Marco called Dr. Reed, Vincent ordered without taking his eyes off Ivy. "And clean this up. I want to know who they were and who sent them." Then he did something that surprised everyone. He took off his coat and draped it over Ivy's shoulders, gently took the gun from her hand. "You're safe now," he said, in a voice softer than anyone had ever heard from him. "You did very well." Ivy looked at him, and for the first time she let herself lean on someone. She leaned into Vincent, and he caught her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After the attack in the garden, Vincent tripled security. Guards were posted throughout the mansion. The surveillance system was upgraded. No one was allowed in or out without his approval. Leo survived. The bullet passed through his shoulder without hitting an artery, and he recovered in Dr. Reed's medical room. But the greatest change wasn't the security. The greatest change was that Vincent began coming to Ivy's room every night. The first night, he said it was to check security. The second night, he said it was to make sure she wasn't having nightmares. The third night, he said nothing at all. He simply came and sat in the armchair by the window. And they began to talk. Not meaningless small talk, not probing questions or polite lies, but real conversations, the kind neither of them had had with anyone in many years. They started with small things, the book Ivy was reading, the work Vincent had to deal with that day, the unusual cold of December this year. But slowly, as darkness filled the room and only the night lamp glowed, their walls began to fall. One night, Ivy asked about the scar on his face. Vincent was silent for a long time, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to tell her about his father, Jeppe Castellano, the previous Mafia boss, a man the outside world feared, but whose family lived in terror. He beat his wife. He beat his children with belts, with fists, with whatever was at hand when he was drunk or angry, or simply wanted to remind everyone who owned the house. "This scar," Vincent touched his cheek, "is from my 14th birthday. I spilled wine on his shirt in front of guests. He waited until they left and then cut my face with his ring. He said it was so I'd remember never to embarrass him again." Ivy listened without speaking. Her hand tightened until her nails cut into her palm. She understood deeply. "My mother endured 18 years, Vincent continued, his voice rough as if the words were tearing at his throat. "Then one day she couldn't anymore. She waited until I was at school, until Sophia was at school. Then she swallowed a whole bottle of sleeping pills and never woke up." He paused and took a deep breath. "I was 16 when I found her on the bed. She looked like she was sleeping, but she was cold." The room fell into heavy silence. Ivy didn't know what to say. There were no words that could soften that kind of pain, so she didn't speak. She rose from the bed, went to where Vincent sat, and sat on the floor beside his feet. "We're the same," she said softly, eyes on the window, on the dark outside. "We were raised by pain. We carry scars no one sees. We're so lonely, we don't even know how not to be lonely anymore." Vincent looked down at her. In the dark, he saw her more clearly than ever, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. He saw a broken soul like his own, saw someone beaten down by life who still stood, saw a warrior in the shape of a thin, fragile girl. He didn't know what he was doing when his hand reached out in the dark, searching for hers. And she didn't pull away when his fingers touched hers. They sat there in silence, hand in hand, two broken souls touching for the first time. No promises, no declarations of love, only the connection of two people too tired of fighting alone. And in that moment, both Vincent and Ivy felt a little less alone. Sofia Castellano changed her attitude toward Ivy after the attack in the garden. She no longer saw her as an opportunist or a threat, but with the respect one woman has for another, who chose to fight instead of surrender. So when Sofia offered to take Ivy shopping for new clothes, Vincent agreed on the condition that guards accompany them. They went to an upscale boutique in Manhattan that Sofia frequented. Ivy felt out of place among the expensive dresses and overly polite salespeople. But Sofia patiently guided her, choosing simple, elegant clothes that suited her small frame. They had just stepped out of the shop carrying their bags when a man blocked their path. Grady stood there in a police uniform, a fake smile on his lips and sharp eyes behind the friendly mask. Ivy recognized him instantly, and her blood seemed to freeze. "Miss," Grady said with feigned concern, "I'm Detective Grady with the New York Police Department. I've been worried about you since you disappeared from the 4th Street Bridge area. Are you all right? Is anyone forcing you to stay somewhere? If you need help, I can protect you." Ivy froze as memories of rainy nights under the bridge crashed back, his heel crushing her cans, his contemptuous voice calling her trash, the flashlight like a blade in the dark. She wanted to speak, to scream that he was the one who had tormented her, but her throat closed and no words came. Sofia stepped forward, placing herself between Ivy and Grady, her gray eyes icy. "Detective Grady," she said slowly with open sarcasm, "I know you. You're the corrupt cop who extorts the homeless and protects drug dealers on the Lower East Side. Don't perform for me." Grady's face shifted and the smile vanished, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about. I only want to make sure this girl isn't being held against her will. The Castellano family isn't known for being safe. She's leaving with me right now." Sofia snorted and took out her phone. "Touch her and I'll call my brother." And you know what Vincent Castellano does to anyone who touches what's his. Grady looked at Sofia, then at the approaching guards, and knew he'd lost this round. He stepped back, but before turning away, he looked at Ivy with venom in his eyes. "We'll meet again," he whispered, so only she could hear. "And next time, no one will be there to protect you." Sofia pulled Ivy away immediately and called Vincent on the way back. When they reached the mansion, Vincent was already waiting in the hall, his face carved from stone, gray eyes burning with a fury he rarely showed. He didn't ask if Ivy was all right. He only looked at her, saw the fear she tried to hide, and that was enough for him to order Marco to investigate Grady at once. "I want everything on him," Vincent said, his voice cold as steel. "Everything he's done, everyone he's connected to, every crime he's covered up, and I want to know if he's tied to Moretti." Marco nodded and vanished to carry out the order. But the investigation didn't stop with Grady. Vincent also ordered a background search on Ivy, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to know who had hurt her, and he wanted to know so he could take revenge. The report came 2 days later, and when Marco placed it on Vincent's desk, his face went pale as if he just read his own death sentence to him. Vincent read about Ivy's mother dying of cancer when Ivy was 16, about her stepfather, Thomas Sullivan, abusing her from 16 to 18 in ways the report didn't dare detail, about her running away and living on the streets, about the trafficking ring that kidnapped her when she was 22 and held her for 8 months in a living hell before she escaped, and about the baby she carried after the rape and lost in her 5th month because her body was too broken to sustain it. Vincent finished the report and sat motionless for a long time. His hands clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms and bled without him noticing. Then he stood, went to the window, and stared into the darkness. "Find her stepfather," he said, his voice no longer that of a mafia boss, but of a devil released from chains. "And find the traffickers who held her. I don't care where they are or what they're doing. Find them and bring me their information." On Christmas Eve, the Castellano mansion glowed with lights and the scent of pine. Sophia had organized a small gathering with only the closest members of the family: Marco, Leo, who had recovered, Dr. Reed, Rosa, and a few loyal guards. No outside guests, no display of power. Only family as the Castellanos defined it. Ivy stood in a corner of the living room, shy in the deep blue dress Sophia had chosen for her. She'd never attended a party like this. During the years under the bridge, Christmas had only been a colder night than usual, with distant lights from homes she didn't belong to. But tonight, for the first time in many years, she felt part of something. The evening was warm and gentle, with Marco's laughter as he told stories, Rosa's affectionate scolding as she urged everyone to eat more, and even Leo's rare smile toward Ivy as he thanked her again for saving his life in the garden. Vincent sat at the head of the table watching everyone, his eyes constantly searching for Ivy across the room. When the evening ended and gifts were exchanged, Vincent stood and walked to her. The room grew quiet and all eyes turned toward them. But Vincent didn't care. He only looked at her with gray eyes, holding something she didn't dare name. "I have something for you," he said, and took a small black velvet box from his pocket. Ivy's heart raced as she opened it with trembling fingers and caught her breath at what lay inside. A white gold chain, delicate and elegant, with a perfectly crafted clasp meant to hold a ring. Her mother's ring. "The old chain is about to break," Vincent said casually, though his ears were faintly red in the light. "I thought you might need a new one to keep it safe." Ivy looked at the necklace, then at Vincent, and something inside her finally gave way. Not in pain like before, but like a dam. At last, surrendering to the water, tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. The first tears, not of suffering, but of being seen. No one had ever given her anything. No one had ever noticed the small things that mattered to her. No one had ever cared enough to see that the cheap chain holding the only memory of her mother was wearing away. But Vincent had seen. Vincent had cared. She didn't know what she was doing till she'd already done it. She stepped forward, rose on her toes, and kissed him. Her lips touched his softly and unsteadily, the kiss of someone who had forgotten how to trust and was trying to learn again. Vincent froze for a moment as if he couldn't believe it. Then his hand slipped around her waist, drew her closer, and he kissed her back, not softly now, but with hunger and urgency, as if she were air and he were drowning, as if he'd waited for this moment all his life, without knowing. The room fell away. Marcos and Sophia's murmurs faded. The world narrowed to two people holding each other under Christmas lights, two broken souls finally finding one another. When they parted, Ivy still trembled in his arms, and Vincent looked at her with eyes utterly changed. No longer cold, no longer distant, only a gentleness meant for her alone. And from that night on, everything between them was different. 1 week after Christmas night, the firestorm came without warning. Antonio Moretti had waited long enough, gathered enough information, and prepared carefully enough to launch the most lethal strike against the Castellano Empire. It began at 3 o'clock in the morning when a bomb exploded at Vincent's main warehouse in Brooklyn, the place that held millions of dollars in goods and served as the nerve center of his operations. Flames surged like a ravenous beast, devouring everything in reach. 15 minutes later, a second bomb detonated at Vincent's nightclub in Manhattan, then a third at the gas station front in Queens. Moretti didn't just want to hurt Vincent. He wanted to burn everything he had built. Vincent was woken by a phone ringing nonstop and reports flooding in like rain. He ran from his room, shouting orders for Marco to mobilize, for Leo to tighten mansion security, for all units to be ready. And in the chaos, no one noticed the mansion system had been breached. Grady had done his work. With Moretti's help, he'd bribed one outer guard and gotten the code to disable cameras on the east wing where Ivy's room was. While Vincent and Marco rushed out, Grady slipped in like a ghost. Ivy was asleep when her door flew open. She barely had time to open her eyes before a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and the sick, familiar smell of cigarettes filled her nose. Grady grinned in the dark, his face lit by hallway light, like a devil rising from hell. "Miss me, sewer rat," he whispered. "I told you we'd meet again." Ivy struggled, but he was stronger, and she was still weak. A blow to the side of her head, and her world went dark. When she woke, she was somewhere else. An abandoned warehouse with gray concrete walls, the stink of mold and rot, a bare bulb swinging above. She was tied to a wooden chair, ropes biting into her skin. Grady stood before her, holding the same baton he had once used to threaten her under the bridge. Only now he didn't just threaten. Now he had control. "You know," Grady said, lazily twirling it, "I was angry when you vanished. I had plans for you. Interesting plans. But then you went and became Castellano's whore." He spat at her feet, a homeless waif thinking she could be a queen. "Don't dream." The first blow drove the air from her lungs. She folded forward, gasping, but the ropes held her. The second split her lip, blood on her chin. The third and fourth and fifth came with hissing insults, calling her trash, filth, something society should throw away, unworthy of life, and certainly unworthy of Castellano. Ivy didn't scream. She'd forgotten how. Screaming had only ever made them enjoy it more. So she closed her eyes and went somewhere they couldn't touch, where her mother was still alive and singing her to sleep. Grady stopped, panting, eyes wild. "Why aren't you crying?" he shouted, yanking her hair. "Why aren't you begging? I want you to beg." Ivy opened her eyes, pale green, bruised and swollen, but frighteningly calm. She looked straight at him and said hoarsely, "You'll be dead before sunrise." Grady laughed, echoing off concrete. "You're crazy. You think Castellano will find you? You think anyone cares about a homeless wretch like you?" Ivy didn't answer because she didn't need to. She knew Vincent would come somewhere in the mansion. Vincent returned from the explosions to find the real nightmare. Ivy's room empty, window open, and on her pillow a note in Grady's scrawl saying, "Well, if you want your whore back, come find me, devil." Vincent read it, and something in him shattered, not in weakness, but like a beast finally freed from chains. Marco arrived wounded and pale at Vincent's expression. "Boss?" he said anxiously. Vincent only looked at him with eyes that had become bottomless black, and spoke 3 words. "Find her now." Vincent lifted Ivy into his arms gently, as if she were made of a glass that could shatter at any moment. She was thinner than he remembered, smaller in his arms, and when he felt her weight, felt her weak breath against his chest. Something inside him finally broke. The devil of Manhattan, the man who'd killed dozens tonight without blinking, who'd tortured and threatened without hesitation, stood in the blood-soaked warehouse and cried. Tears ran down his face, hot and unstoppable, falling into Ivy's tangled hair like rain. It was the first time he'd cried since finding his mother on that bed 20 years ago. 20 years of locking his tears away, turning himself into stone, refusing anyone the chance to hurt him. And now a thin, homeless girl with green eyes had shattered every wall he'd built and reminded him he was still human. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice broken. "I didn't protect you. I let them take you." Ivy lifted her bruised, trembling hand and pressed it gently to his lips, stopping him. "You came," she said hoarsely but warmly. "That's all that matters. You came for me, but you're hurt," he said, looking at her bruised face, split lip, swollen eyes, rage rising again. "He hurt you. I'm still alive," Ivy interrupted, and she smiled, small but real enough to twist his heart. "I've survived worse than this, and this time, I wasn't alone. This time I had you. Take me home." Vincent nodded, not trusting his voice, and carried her out of the hellish warehouse past bodies and blood where Marco waited with the car. He didn't let her go the entire ride back. She rested against his chest, and though her body ached, she felt safer than she ever had. Derived Reed was waiting with full equipment at the mansion. He went pale at Ivy's condition, but quickly regained his professional calm and began working, stitching wounds, wrapping bruises, checking for broken bones. Fortunately, Grady hadn't caused permanent damage. Only pain and pain would heal. "She needs rest," Dr. Reed told Vincent afterward. "At least a few weeks. No stress, no exertion, and she needs someone with her after what happened. She may have nightmares. She may panic." Vincent nodded. "I'll be here," he said, and it wasn't empty. In the days that followed, he never left her room. He slept in the armchair beside her bed, woke whenever she stirred, held her hand when nightmares came. He fed her when she was too weak to hold a spoon. He read to her when she couldn't sleep. He did everything the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast shouldn't, and he didn't care who judged him. Marco ran the outside operations. Sofia managed finances. The Castellano Empire might have been shaken by Moretti's attack. But Vincent didn't care because for the first time in his life, he had something more important than power. He had her, and he wasn't ever going to lose her again. In the weeks that followed, justice was delivered in the only way Vincent Castellano knew how to deliver it. Grady was arrested in the hospital where he was being treated for gunshot wounds to both knees. Evidence of corruption, kidnapping, assault, and ties to organized crime was sent simultaneously to the FBI and the press, making it impossible for anyone to bury the case. He lost his badge, his pension, his freedom, and even the ability to walk normally for the rest of his life. In prison, rumors about his abuse of homeless women spread like wildfire, and Grady quickly learned that there were places worse than death. Moretti fared no better. His attack on the Castellano Empire exposed him, and Vincent struck back with 10 times the force. Within a month, all of Moretti's businesses were shut down or taken over. His loyalists were bought off or eliminated, and Moretti himself, after trying to flee to Mexico, was found in a rundown motel with a bullet in his head. The police ruled it a suicide, though no one truly believed that. But Vincent didn't stop with those who had directly hurt Ivy. He went after the ghosts of her past. Thomas Sullivan, Ivy's stepfather, was living a quiet life in Arizona with a new wife and 2 stepchildren. He thought he'd escaped. He thought the past was buried with the girl he'd once abused. He was wrong. Vincent didn't kill him. He did something worse. He hired private investigators to gather evidence, tracked down other victims Sullivan had left behind over the years, and sent everything to local police and the media. The scandal exploded like a bomb. Sullivan was arrested in front of his family, exposed on national television as a child abuser and violent predator, and became an object of public disgust and condemnation. The traffickers from years before didn't escape either. Vincent used his network to hunt them down, and when he found them, he sent the information to Interpol and the FBI. The trafficking ring was dismantled. Dozens of victims were rescued, and the people who'd held Ivy in hell for 8 months finally faced justice. Ivy knew what Vincent had done. He didn't hide it from her because he didn't want any secrets between them. She sat quietly as he told her, looking out the window, her face unreadable. And when he asked how she felt, she was silent for a long time before answering. "I don't forgive them," she said calmly but firmly. "I never will. What they did to me, to others, doesn't deserve forgiveness." Then she looked at him, and in her green eyes was something new. Not emptiness or pain anymore, but peace. But I let go. I don't let them live in my mind anymore. They already took enough from me. I won't give them anything else. From that day on, Ivy began to change in ways no one expected. She asked Vincent if she could study to earn a GED she'd never had the chance to finish. She studied hard, spending hours in the library with books. And when Sophia asked what she wanted to do afterward, her answer surprised them both. "I want to study psychology," Ivy said, her eyes bright with purpose. "I want to help people like me, people who've been hurt, upset, forgotten by society. I want them to know they're not alone, that they can survive, that there's always hope, no matter how dark things get." Vincent looked at her and saw not the ghost he'd pulled from the freezing river, but a strong, luminous woman shining from within. She'd turned her pain into purpose, and he'd never loved her more than he did in that moment. 6 months after that terrible night, on a warm spring afternoon, Vincent took Ivy to 4th Street Bridge. She didn't know why he wanted to come here, but she trusted him, and so she let him lead the way. They stood on the bridge, looking down at the river below, the same river that had witnessed the moment that changed both their lives 6 months earlier. The water shimmered in the spring sunlight, gentle and peaceful, nothing like the black, raging current of the rainy November night before. "It's hard to believe it's the same river," Ivy said softly, her hand resting on the railing. "That night it wanted to kill me. Now it looks like it could never hurt anyone." Vincent stood beside her, staring down at the surface, remembering the drowning, the darkness, the cold, remembering the small hand that had grabbed his collar and pulled him toward the light. He had died that night. The devil of Manhattan, who had nothing but power and loneliness, had sunk to the bottom and never come back. The man who was pulled out was someone else, a man who could love, who could fear loss, who could cry in hope. You saved me, he said, turning to her. Not just that night in the river, but every day after. You saved me from loneliness, from darkness, from myself. Ivy looked at him, and in her green eyes, once extinguished, a new light now shone. She had changed in 6 months. Her skin was healthier, her body stronger, and most of all, her soul had begun to heal. She still had nightmares sometimes, still startled at loud sounds. But she wasn't the ghost under the bridge anymore. She was a woman learning how to live again. That night, she said slowly, looking down at the river, I thought I'd die. I jumped because I had nothing left to lose. I saved you because it was the only thing I could do that made my life mean something. I wasn't afraid of dying. I even wanted to die a little. Then she turned back to him, and her smile was more beautiful than any flower blooming that spring. But now I want to live. For the first time in many years, I really want to live because I have you, because I have a family, because I have a reason to wake up every morning. Vincent felt his heart race, and he, who'd faced death hundreds of times without fear, felt his hands tremble as he took a small black velvet box from his pocket. Ivy looked at the box, then at him, eyes wide. Vincent went down on one knee right there on the bridge where everything began and opened the box. Inside was a diamond ring, not large or showy, but perfect in the way Ivy was always perfect to him. I don't know how to propose, he said, his voice rougher than usual. I've never loved anyone before you. I never thought I could love anyone, but you jumped into that freezing river to save a stranger. And since then, you've saved my soul every day. I want to spend the rest of my life repaying that debt. Ivy Sullivan, will you be my wife? Tears ran down Ivy's cheeks, but she was smiling, the brightest smile he'd ever seen on her face. She nodded, unable to speak through her tight throat, and Vincent stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and held her as if he'd never let go. The wedding took place a month later, small and intimate, with only the closest people present. Sophia was maid of honor in a pale blue dress, smiling beside the woman she'd once doubted, but now loved like a sister. Marco was best man, eyes red throughout the ceremony despite trying to hide it. Dr. Ray Reed stood in the front row. Rosa sobbed in the back, and Leo, still limping from his old wound, stood tall and proud as if witnessing a miracle. Ivy wore a simple white dress, not the kind from magazines, but the kind that felt like herself. On her chest, her mother's silver ring still rested on the white gold chain Vincent had given her at Christmas. I have nothing to give you but myself, she said in her vows. A girl from under a bridge with too many scars and too many ghosts. But you showed me that it's enough, that I am enough. I'll love you every day from now until forever. Vincent held her hands and spoke his vows. You jumped into a freezing river to save a stranger. You didn't know who I was or what I did, and you still saved me. That's when I knew you were the best person I'd ever met. I'll spend my life being worthy of you. They kissed and the room applauded, and Ivy thought of her mother, of the ring on her chest, and whispered silently, I found my family, Mom. 1 year after the wedding, Ivy Castellano was sitting in a university lecture hall, carefully taking notes during a lecture on trauma psychology. She was the oldest student in the class, but also the most diligent. Every page she read, every lecture she listened to, brought her closer to her dream of helping people who'd suffered the way she had. Alongside her studies, Ivy and Vincent founded the Bridge of Hope Foundation, named after 4th Street Bridge, where their story began. The foundation provided temporary housing, food, medical care, and most importantly, vocational training for homeless people who wanted to change their lives. In its first year, they helped more than 200 people find their footing again. One evening, as Ivy was reading in her room, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. You don't know me, but I used to live under 5th Street Bridge. Detective Grady used to harass me too, the way he harassed you. I heard about what you did about your foundation, about Grady being arrested. I want to thank you. You saved more people than you realize. Ivy read the message and felt something warm spread through her chest. She replied, I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was saved by another person and wanted to do the same. The final message from the stranger made her eyes sting. That's exactly what heroes do. That night, Ivy stood on the mansion balcony looking at the city lights below. The spring breeze brushed her hair, and she placed her hand on her belly where a new life was growing. Vincent stepped out and stood beside her the way he had every night and every day for a year, never leaving her side. "Vincent," she said softly. "What is it?" he asked, turning to her. "I have something to tell you." Ivy took his hand and placed his large, calloused palm on her belly. Vincent froze for a second, then his gray eyes widened, shining in the city light. "We're going to have a baby," Ivy said with a radiant smile. Vincent couldn't speak. He only pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. And for the second time in his life, the devil of Manhattan cried, not from pain like the first time in the abandoned warehouse, but from happiness, from gratitude, from finally having everything he'd never dared to dream of. A wife who loved him not for his power or money, but for who he truly was. And now a child, a small life that would call him father. They stood there in each other's arms beneath the star-filled night, two broken souls who'd found each other and healed together. From a ghost under a bridge, Ivy had become a wife, a future mother, part of a family. It had all begun with a rainy night, a car falling into a river, and a girl who decided saving a stranger's life was worth more than her own safety. Some debts can never truly be repaid, but they can be honored every day with love, with care, and with staying together until the end of life. This story teaches us that no one in this world is worthless. No matter where you are, no matter what you've been through, no matter if the world has called you trash, you can still become a miracle in someone else's life. And sometimes the most wounded people are the ones who heal others the most. Believe in yourself, believe in love, and never give up hope. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support our channel. Share this video with people you love, with those who need to be reminded they deserve to be loved. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more moving stories every day. We'd love to know how you felt about Ivy and Vincent's story. Have you ever experienced moments that felt hopeless but later changed? Please share in the comments below. We always listen to what's in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Thank you for being with us.